Hey guys, this is Joe Matalone, and today we're going to take a look at creating reusable directives in AngularJS, with an emphasis on reusable. AngularJS is a framework by Google. It's a very powerful framework. It's very different from something like jQuery, but if you're coming from jQuery or a solid JavaScript background, you should be able to follow along pretty well. So what I'm going to do is let's create a directory for our Angular application, and then in that directory we're going to use Bower to install Angular. And that's going to create a components folder. Inside of that's going to be an Angular folder, and inside that's going to be our Angular JavaScript files. So I'm going to go ahead and just, well, you know what, let's make a new item in there as well. Index.html, and it's going to be a file, and then we can just open up the directory in Sublime, which has been acting really weird on me. I seem to get two windows each time. Alright, so here we are. We've got our index.html, and I'm just going to start off with an HTML5 doc. Go ahead and save that, and then we're going to drop in Angular. So here's our AngularJS, and I'm going to copy that as a tag script and drop it into my page. Okay, so let me stretch this out a little bit. Okay, so an Angular directive can be represented in a number of different ways. One of the coolest one is by creating your own attribute. So I'm gonna, or not your own attribute, your own tag, your own HTML tag. So name is not an HTML tag, but I just created it. This isn't going to show anything in the browser, and I'm going to give it some attributes here. So the first one's going to be for first name, and the second one's going to be for last name. Oops, sorry. All right. So right now that's going to do absolutely nothing. I can go ahead and load it up in the browser. We can see that the name tag that we created is on the page, but the browser has no idea what that is or what to do with it. So now we're going to start with our Angular app. And Angular applications are all modules. And so I'm going to create my first module, and I'm going to call that app. And that's just my variable. You don't actually have to have a variable, but that way I can keep everything modular if I want to split things out into different directories and separate files as the code becomes more complex. It's nice to have that kind of root namespace. So I'm calling mine app, all caps. And my app is an Angular module. Whoops. Angular module named app. And the second argument that it takes is for dependency injection. So if there were other modules that I wanted to inject into my application, those can be custom modules, or they could be some of the built-in modules that come with Angular. Right now, I have no dependencies, and what I want to do is I want to make that name tag work. And again, I'm going to create a directive. So using my namespace that I've got here, for my application, I'm going to create a new directive, and I'm going to call it name. It could be called just about anything here. In order to access it, I'm going to need to tell the directive, what to look for on the page. So the second argument is a function. Now, what we're going to return is the directive object. So I'm going to start with an empty object, and there's a lot of different options you can include in here, but there's three that are vital. And the first one is the restriction type, and that's restrict. And in our case, E is for element. There's element, attribute, class, and comment, and the abbreviations for those are E, A, C, and M. I don't really know how to do the comment one. I've never done it. And it's kind of weird, but I can show you how to do the rest here. So we're doing an element, so the system knows to look for an element. And the element in this case is going to be name. So it knows I'm looking for an element called name. The second one is the linking function. And just now we're not really going to do much with that. But what the linking function does is it takes in the scope, the element, and the attributes of that element, and you should probably really write out scope, element, attributes as the arguments. But one thing I do is I just write out SEA, and that helps. And then the third thing is the template. Now the template could actually be template URI, or it might be URL. I'll update you on that in just a moment. And then that can point to a separate HTML file that contains the string that is going to be our template. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, since you can't see the name value, what I want to put inside that name tag is an H1, and then obviously I'm going to close that. Whoops. And then here, what I want to put is the name. So I can see that I've got this attribute of first, I've got this attribute of last, and this is where the linking function comes in. I need a way to tell the template what I'm using. When it goes to render this, it needs to know how to get at that data. So in the linking function, that first and last, those are attributes. So what I could say here is S, which is short for scope. Because and you know what? Let me just go ahead and do that. Scope. Okay, so there's our scope, and I can say scope dot. Let's just do full name, and we'll put these together. Equals. Now the attribute I want to get is first. Then I want to put a space in there, and last. So now in the scope of this element. Full name equals first and last with a space in between. So in my template, I can just say full name. Now the other thing I need to do is kind of close all this inside of my module. A common way to do that is just drop it right into the HTML, but technically, as long as it's some tag that's closed around it, it's going to work. So ng app equals app. So what we're expecting to happen here right now is an H1 tag inside of that name tag with the inner HTML of Joe space Matt alone. So let's save that and give this a try. So we've got it. There we go. And you can see that it is actually inside the name tag, which doesn't really exist. And it's got this ng binding, which Angular is adding on at the last second, or at runtime, basically. Another thing that we can tack on here, since name isn't really a thing, is replace. And we can say true on that. And then what that's going to do is it's going to replace the entire tag with our template and our dynamic data. So let's take a look at that really quick. And now you can see we've still got our attributes, first and last, which are fine. We've still got our ng binding, but now it's an H1 tag with the value inside. It's got our template there, and it's replaced the entire name tag. One thing to mention about data attributes, or I'm sorry, about the directive attributes, is if you're concerned about HTML5 validation and you want to use the data list element, you can replace this, with, you can tack on data dash, and that'll work just fine. You don't have to update any of your other code. So I refresh this now, and you can see everything's still working just fine. So Angular is very forgiving, or it understands that, you know, the data list attribute is HTML compliant, whereas just making up attributes on your own might not be. So so that's a look at how to create the element version of a directive. The other one we could do is, so let's say I want to make this an H1, and then what I'm doing is I'm giving it an attribute called name, which probably isn't really good because input values can have names. So let's call this namer. Okay, so my attribute is going to be namer, and then I'm going to close that. So I've got an H1 that has an attribute called namer, an attribute data first, and an attribute called data last. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to change my directive name, and I'm going to change the restriction to A, which is attribute. So now it's looking for the attribute namer, and then technically, in this case, since I'm just going to be filling that in, so now I'm going to just put that inside the HTML. I don't need to replace the H1, and we're good to go. And I obviously didn't need to double up on the H1 tags. All right, so let's run that. Same exact output. So we're good there. And then the last one I'm going to show you is class. So what I could do, instead of having this custom attribute, is I could say class equals namer, and we're going to get the exact same thing. So boom, there you go. we've got a directive. Now, in terms of reusability, let's make a second one. Oops. Paste that in. And here we're going to say Mr. Spartacus. Well, Spartacus. Okay. So now we would hope that we would have two HTML tags or H1 tags. The first one with the inner HTML of Joe Matalone and the second one with Mr. Spartacus. And I'm guessing, because I named it that, you can guess what's going to happen. We get Mr. Spartacus 2 times. Now, the reason we got that is because the scope.fullName is getting overwritten I mean, if I did that 100 times and then the last one said Joe Matalone, then they would all say Joe Matalone. So what we need to do here is we need to isolate the scope to the instance of the directive. And the way we do that is in the return object, we just need to take scope and we need to pass in something true. This works, just passing in an empty object. I don't know why it works really. I guess that is true. But you could just say true here, which I think is probably what it says in the documentation. I could also say 1 equals 1. That would work. Just as long as that statement is true, you're good to go. But yeah, people do seem to want to pass in that empty object in most of the examples that I see. So now it's reusable. We could have a bunch of these on the page, and let me just try that out. So we're going to have a Jim Spartacus and a John. Let's go with the Smith, and actually let's go with the Jones here. Okay, so now we're going to have 4 different names. Each one is its own directive. However, you know, we can very easily change. So if we just wanted to say scope.fullName equals that, we'll leave that alone. Scope.first equals the first, and scope.last equals last, and then down here, if we wanted to do last, comma, well, no, we'd have to do it like this. Last, comma, space, first. That'll work just fine too. So now we've got our last and our comma first. So you can see we can change the directive on the fly. That's going to affect it everywhere else, and we don't have to update our HTML. Now, if we want to make this really modular and we want to be able to reuse it or pass it on to somebody else to use in their application, obviously we won't know the namespace for their application. I mean, that right there is enough to say, you know, this still isn't fully reusable. So what we can do is we can create a nameless Angular module, just like we did before. Well, except we're not going to give it a name. Angular.module. Having a hard time here. Namer. We'll call our module namer. And then it doesn't have any dependencies. And now what we do is we tack on this directive to that module. You see that the dot directive is what I'm doing there. I'm just making it all one string. So now we have this module called namer that has a directive called namer. And so this could be coming in from some other file. It could be, and actually let me just go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a new file called namer.js. And I'm going to paste this in there. So we've got this namer module. And what I'm going to do right here, after our Angular that we're bringing in, let's see, we dropped that in the root directory, so namer.js. So now we've got this app that does absolutely nothing right now, and it certainly doesn't know what to do with these 4 H1s. If I refresh that, you know, the data, the tags are there, but it's not doing anything with it. And what's really cool is now this dependency injection here, I can just inject the namer module into that, and therefore it's going to inherit the namer directive as well. And now if I refresh this, we've got our directives. We've got a very reusable directive in its own module, and you can see here, if you're going to be building out modules that are going to be injected into, you know, more complicated applications, you could really build this out and have all sorts of things. If you go look at the Angular UI or Angular Bootstrap projects, this is exactly what they're doing, and then you're just injecting your their module, into your application. So that's how you create a reusable directive in AngularJS.